What is up, guys? Welcome back for another episode of Mortal Realms Monday. I am Jason, and today we're going to be bringing you a Night of Shrouds from episode or issue 19. So, without further ado, let's take a look at how I painted this lovely little fellow. So there's a couple of things you'll notice here before we get started. The first one is that I've gone ahead and primed the whole thing in white primer. This is just a generic white primer from the local hardware store, but you can use any spray primer that you want. Though I do recommend white for night haunts. And you can see here that the knight isn't actually attached to the horse. What I did was very carefully with a sharp blade was placed a cut just along the edge of where his cloak joins to the horse, and the same on the back part of it, just at the bottom there. So I placed a cut along here, and then another one here, and then I just smoothed off the bottom of the second cut just to neaten it up a little bit, and obviously just try and remove that again. This way I can remove the horse or the rider, get access to all of under his cloak nice and easy, and I can access the rib cage the rider obscures mostly once he's in position. Obviously the other way to do it would be to paint half of the horse. Because of the way that this is assembled, the rib cage goes in to one half first, and then the other half with the rider attached clamps on. So I found it easier and better to clip the rider off, or carefully cut the rider off, and go from there. Paint the two separate, much easier. So let's get started with the painting. So to start off with, I'm going to use one of my favourite technical paints for painting night haunts, and that is Hexwraith Flame. This does give a nice sort of spooky green effect. I don't like to use it over an entire model as a whole piece, but for giving those little trails, as you can see that I'm painting here, it does look nice when you do the Hexwraith Flame, and then just a dry brushing of white just over the very tips. However, I will coat the entire model of this with the Hexwraith Flame, just a nice even coat throughout, just so that any other colours that we layer over the top will blend nicely into that Hexwraith Flame, rather than having any sort of transition from the Hexwraith Flame to white and then to whatever colour is layered over the top. I think I did thin this slightly. This isn't straight out the pot. I applied this to a wet palette first, and then I think the ratio is probably 3 parts Hexwraith to 1 part water, just to thin it ever so slightly. As it is a technical paint, it's not a shade, so it's not going to sink into those recesses fully on its own, and it will tint the surfaces more than what a shade or a wash will. But that is kind of what we want. So all I'm trying to do is just get a nice even coat, and then go back over, and some of those recesses just dab a little bit more of the Hexwraith in there, just to darken up some of those recesses slightly. So we'll jump back in just a sec and see what we're at after this has been applied. Right, so you can see here the effect we've got once the green or the flame has been applied. And next I'm going to take some Night Haunt Gloom. Now for this, I do thin this down quite a bit. This is probably a 1-to-1 ratio of gloom to water, maybe even a little bit more water. This is just to get it thin enough that it's almost a glaze, and all I'm trying to do here is just cover the majority of the horse that I want in this darker colour, and as I get towards the area that I still want to be green, I'll feather it out slightly. As it is a thin paint, or has been thinned down, it will go down, you know, it will thin down quite nicely and trying to think of the word, graduate off. Also, I do rinse the brush very quickly and just take the wet brush and blend back over that transition from the Nighthaunt Gloom to the Hex Wraith, just to smooth it out as much as possible. If you try to do it with the Nighthaunt Gloom on there, chances are you're just going to keep moving that transition mark further down past where you want it, and it's not going to transition as nice. So you know, just a little tip is, as you get to where you want to transition, just quickly dip your brush in the rinse pot, rattle it about a little bit just to get the majority of the paint off, and then just gently feather it down and then back up on itself, and that will feather that edge off nicely. Obviously, for anywhere else on the horse, I'm just going to keep applying over and over until I've got a nice even coat on there. For me, with this technique, I think it took probably around 15 layers. If you haven't got the patience, or you're not confident enough to do it in layers, then you can thicken up the paint slightly, and I'd say maybe a 2-to-1 ratio of paint to water. Obviously you're not going to get as smooth a transition, but if you apply the technique of rinsing your brush off and quickly feathering out that edge, you should get a fairly decent transition from the Gloom to the Hex Wraith. But like I say, it's not going to be quite as smooth, but it shouldn't be too much to worry about, especially when we add some of the other dry brushing and, you know, some of the other effects on a little bit later on. So what I'll do is jump on ahead, and we can have a look where we're at. So I'll be back in just a tick. Right, so with that done, I'm now going to take some Sotek green, and using a dry brush, and I'm just going to, as you can tell, dry brush this over all of the Nighthaunt Gloom areas. And all this is going to do is just pick off those raised and sort of more flat surfaces, and just give a little bit of highlight to the gloom. It's not going to be a harsh highlight. For this, I prefer to have a little bit more of a subtle highlight until we add those heavy edges or those hard edges later on. So just a quick dry brushing of this over all of that area. You can see the transition from the Nighthaunt Gloom to the Hex Wraith Flame there on the back legs and the belly on the side. And you'll notice that on this side of the model, the rib area has more of the flame, and the other side has more skin and less flame. So obviously bear that in mind when dry brushing. You don't want to dry brush this Sotek green over the Hex Wraith Flame area. You just want it on anywhere where there is Nighthaunt Gloom. You can see I'm applying it to the back legs here. Again, that is very liberally, very dry. By the time I've got to the back of the legs, most of the paint has come off where I've been working on the front end of the horse there. So there's just a small amount coming off the back. If you had any trouble with the blending, or if you have any trouble with the blending, to smooth it out a little bit more, you can go back in with some Hex Wraith Flame. I do think I did it on parts of this, and just blend that back up into the or over the top, almost like a glaze over the top of the Nighthaunt Gloom, and that will just give a bit of a smoother transition as the two colours, the thin green, sort of contrasts with the gloom underneath. And welcome back. So next up we take some White Scar, and again with the dry brushing, just a very small amount. Now with this, the brush itself is still damp from cleaning off the Sotek green. I've dried it as much as possible, but I did want to leave it slightly, just a tad damp. And what this will do is remove some of that chalkiness that you get from dry brushing. You do have to be very careful with it, because if the paint is if the brush is too wet, as I noticed on that small part there, the paint will run a little bit, and you won't get that dry brush effect. You want it just damp enough just to remove some of that chalkiness that dry brushing can do sometimes, especially with whites. So I'm just focusing this right over the tips of the flames. So obviously the tips of the tail here, and picking up some of the highlights, and the ones at the front underneath and on his rib cage there. And I do also take this a little bit over some of the Nighthaunt gloom on the back legs, just to soften those up slightly, so that I can go back in and apply some Hexwraith flame over the top to get a sort of blend between the two. The idea that I wanted with this was that this is a physical apparition that is taking form, so it goes from the ghostly green and becomes more solid. So obviously the head and the front shoulders, the front legs are becoming more solid and more skeleton-like, and the back legs are just transitioning from that green flame into the gloom skin. So I wanted the back legs to have a little bit more of a mix between the two colours, just to give it that transition look, as though it's coming out of the ground with this spooky green effect. Right, next up I'm going to take some Ushapti bone, and this is going to be for the head of the horse, as well as the two front legs there, and all of the rib cage that we can see poking through. Obviously I didn't do this first because the dry brushing would have put the Sotek green or the white over the top of these ribs, and that just wouldn't look right, and we'd have to repaint them. So obviously this is why I've got it at this step. Painting the inside of the rib cage, not so easy on this model. I probably could have removed it from the base and gone right in underneath, but as it was undercoated white, the inside of the rib cage, it doesn't get too noticed. I think I do pick some of the area that I can reach with the brush, so that, you know, if you're looking underneath the model, you're going to see a little bit of white, but the majority of it you're not going to notice, especially when gaming, which is, you know, what we're painting for really, is to play. Although this is a little bit more detailed painting, that's because it's a leader unit. It's not designed to go and win any awards or anything. I just wanted a nice looking piece on the table leading my army. So as you can see here, I'm able to get to these ribs super easy now that that rider is out of the way, and you'll notice later on, once I reattach the rider, that it blends in so well back with itself that you would never know it was clipped off in the first place. So if you're confident enough, I highly recommend clipping him off and giving yourself a bit of an easier job on reaching these ribs and painting the two pieces separate. So obviously I do this for all the ribs, and you can see here I'm going just on the inside, being careful not to touch anything like that there. Wipe it off with my thumb as soon as I do. But yeah, so all the ribs, the front legs there, you can see you've got the two parts of the leg, the bone parts, and the skull of the horse. Apart from he's got a sort of faceplate on the front. So obviously I leave that. If you want to paint the rider as we're going along with this, then at this point I would also paint the horns on the horse. The horse does have one moulded onto it, or modelled onto it. The other horn is modelled onto the rider, so you could paint that as well as the rider's arms. If not, then I do go into that later, so we'll be able to take a look at how I do that anyway. But for now, let's jump on to the next step and see where we're at. Right, so next up I'm just going to take some Agrak's Earthshade, and a fairly, I think I actually use a standard regiment brush for this, but you can use a medium shade brush from Citadel, or any sort of size 2 or 3 brush. I do apply this to my wet palette, but you can go straight from the pot with this. All this is for is just to apply all over the bone area that we just painted in the Shrouds bone. So yeah, you can see here I'm using the Army Painter regiment brush, which is the equivalent probably to a size 2, size 1 or size 2 brush if you're using artists numbered brushes, but the Citadel medium shade brush a little bit bigger. I'm not sure if they do a small, but that'd work just as well. So all we're doing is just applying it over that bone area, letting the shade stain the surface, and then sit in those recesses, especially between the joints and sort of in some of those dips in the bone, just to add some definition and, you know, some shade in there, and that will really make this bone stand out. If you are new to the hobby, then first of all, welcome to the hobby. You will be spending a lot of money on this, but it is worth it. And although I say that with a lot of money, you can get away with doing things fairly cheap. If you are looking for a set of go-to washes, then my recommendation would be the Agrax Earth shade, non-oil, and probably Reichland Flesh shade. I would say are the 3 most used shades that I use in my models. Reichland Flesh shade I usually use for darkening down gold, as it has a bit of a red tint to it, and it's also great for flesh tones. The Agrax Earth shade obviously good for things on bone, although you can use the Reichland Flesh shade for that as well. Also dulling down or shading in anything that's going to be brown, so woods, leather, you know, things like that. And then the non-oil is pretty much good for the majority of things, darkening down blues, greys and things like that, washing over silver metals. I wouldn't use it so much on gold, but you could probably get away with using it on copper and brass coloured metals, you know, sort of the duller colours. So yeah, you don't have to splash out on a huge range of colours to start with, especially when it comes to shades. You can even get away with a couple of them, you know, non-oil. You could just thin down some black paint, and you're not going to get as good an effect, but you can get somewhere close to it. But if you do want to, you know, just a quick selection of go-to shades, then yeah, those 3 are probably my first 3 recommendations, and then just build up a small collection from those really. So with that said, let's jump on to the next step and see where we start to take it from here. Okay, so next up I'm going to take some non-oil and Drakenhof Nightshade, and this will be a 50-50 mix of the 2, just to darken up that Drakenhof a little bit more. And I'm just going to apply that in any of the recesses along the horse here, as well as just a general wash over the top, almost like a glaze. I'm just looking to tint the horse and the skin just to darken it up ever so slightly. You could, like I said earlier, with washes you don't necessarily need the Drakenhof with this. You could get away with just using the non-oil. However, I would recommend thinning that down slightly if you're going to go with just the non-oil, as that will tend to leave sort of oil stains on the flatter areas. It's good for dark recessing, but if you're going to go over a surface, as you can see I'm doing here, then the non-oil on its own, not so great. So all I'm doing here is just taking a little bit more of the wash and just applying it so that it sits down in the bottom of those ribs, and that will just make that skin look a little bit more sunken into those ribs, and make those raised areas stand out a little bit more than they actually are. So I'll just jump on from this step, and we'll be back in just a bit. Okay, so this next step, I'm going to take some flayed one flesh, and I'm going to use this to edge highlight all of the bone areas. Now there is a step before this, but my camera, I forgot to hit record, or I thought it was already recording. And all I did with that step was, with the Ushapti bone, I just went back in, very little paint on the brush, and just a regular round brush, the same as I have been using, the standard brush, and just very carefully almost dry brushed the bone. It was a little bit wetter than normal, than you would for dry brushing, but yeah, just applied that over the bone just to lighten up some of those areas where the agrax sat on the flatter surfaces, and then obviously I left what was in the recesses, so that it looked, it still had that shade there. But yeah, so now I'm just applying this, as you can see, edge highlights right on the edges of the bone, where the two joints are. I do it a little bit over the teeth on the skull, around the curve of the jaw, on the bottom there, and also on the joint at the centre of the jaw, and the back curve here, as well as the underside of the eye, and that raised sort of cheekbone section. And obviously the idea of this is to just give a little bit of highlight to those surfaces and just give them a little bit more definition. So you can see here I'm now doing the inner rib cage. You probably could leave this rib cage without having these highlights added, because obviously the rider's going to be sat over the top, so technically there wouldn't be sharp highlights on there, but it doesn't really matter either way. So yeah, we'll apply these highlights to the rest of the bone, and we'll be back in just a bit. So next up, I'll take some Screaming Bell, and this is for all of the brass areas on the horse. It's the helmet here, and on the rider himself, if you are painting him alongside doing the horse, then that will be the two wings that come off his helmet, as well as the small horn up the front, whereas the mask itself will be done in a different colour, and also the hilt and crossguard for the sword, and the top part and the end of his scarab for his sword. Again, obviously I will be showing you painting that up, so if you are following along, then obviously stick to what we're showing here and paint him separate. If you are painting him at the same time, then obviously you can go ahead and paint it however you like, but those are the areas that I did, and obviously in this order. So with metal, usually you can get away with applying one coat. If you have thinned it slightly, then it may need a couple. Obviously be very careful not to get this anywhere else you've already painted. If you do, just quickly take it off with your thumb. There's a couple of bits later on that I do get a little bit of paint on another part of the model, and don't notice until later, but luckily with the colour scheme here, it's not too difficult to clean up afterwards. Okay, so what I'm doing here is I've taken a 1-to-1 mix of the non-oil and Screaming Bell, and thinned that slightly with a little bit of water, and all I'm doing with a finer brush here is just applying small dots of this mix, this sort of darker metal mix, a little bit dull, just along the faceplate here. And what this does is gives the impression of little dents and texture to the plate. So rather than it just being that straight brass look, this gives it, just a little bit more definition and texture. Obviously you do have to let it dry between coats, And you can go back over. If you go back over, it's going to darken it a little bit. And just sort of pick areas where you want it to be a little bit darker and a little bit lighter, obviously working with where shadows would be. So obviously I've placed it down there to dry, and now coming back to go back over it and darken some of the areas, mostly focusing down around the eye sockets, around the edges of the eyes, and then down towards the nose area, just to darken those up. And what I tend to do is space the spots out a little bit more on lighter areas or highlight areas, and then focus them a little bit more together towards the darker areas. As this is thinned down, what will happen is these will pull together slightly in some areas and give slightly larger splotches, but that is fine. It gives it you know, a really nice texture to what would otherwise be a sort of a straight plain piece of metal. Even if you just threw a wash over the top, that would only sink into a couple of the, you know, a few of the recesses, and it would still be otherwise dull for itself. So next up here, I'm just taking some Agrax Earthshade, and you'll notice that I've added the extra horn, the bone here, painted this one in. So now I'm just adding some Earthshade to this. Obviously you could have done this with or I could have done this whilst I did the other bone. Oh, apologies for the bike there. Nice bike, but not great when you're recording audio. So yeah, as I was saying, I should have really done this horn when I did the rest of the bone. I think at the time I was deciding whether or not to put some of the copper plating over the smoother part of the horn and make it look like he had armour over that. So I left it, but in the end I did decide to just go with a, you know, a straight bone horn. So obviously this is done exactly the same way as the rest of the bone. The shade of Agrax and a slight little dry brushing of Ushapti bone, and then a highlight with the flayed one flesh. Right, so moving on, you can see now that I have attached the rider here, but he is not permanently fixed in yet. This is just so I can paint him a little bit more comfortably whilst he's on the horse there. So obviously I do have to be very careful when painting him not to get paint on the horse that is now essentially finished. So I'm just going ahead and applying the Ushapti bone to the other horn, as well as the rider's arms. So we'll just jump on and take a look at the next step. Okay, so next up I'm going to take some Abaddon Black, and as usual I thin it down slightly, just a small drop of water in with you know, a little bit of the paint, just to get it to flow a little bit easier. And all I'm doing with this is just picking off any areas that I want either black, dark browns, or silvers, or in this case it will be lead belcher, so metallics. So just picking off around the horse. He's got the strap here, as well as the piece that goes into his mouth. The areas that hang down just by the chins will actually be metal, but the strap itself is going to be just a plain black leather. So obviously that's both sides, including where it loops up into his hand. I think I removed the model to be able to get to the part in his hand, as it does come very close to the neck of the horse, but this would also be down the scarab as well. I believe that's what it's called, the sheath for the sword, and also the blade of the sword. The areas that I want in the Screaming Bell, I leave white, so that I can go and apply them the same way that I did with the mask on the horse. Also his cloak, which is going to be brown, so that's the top part of him that's over his shoulders, and his face mask will also be painted black. so that we can go in and paint those darker later. We want a dark base for those areas, and obviously a lighter base for everywhere else, which is why we went in with the white undercoat instead of the black. You'll also notice here that I've painted the horse hooves with Incubi Darkness. I decided that this just didn't look right, and so later on I go back over it with white and bring them down, and then take them back into Hex Wraith Flame, but only on the back two hooves. The front two hooves I do leave with the Incubi Darkness. It was just the back ones, it didn't look fitting with the idea of the ghostly parts changing into the material part. So we'll jump on and take a look at what areas we've got covered black and move on to the next step. Right, so with the black all done, I'm now going to go back with the Screaming Bell and just pick off the areas that I want with the rest of this brass look. So as I said, that's the top and bottom parts of this part of the sword here, or the scarab, the holder. Now for this I do remove the model, the knight, from the horse so that I can get to the back of this, and then I'll leave him off and do a quick painting on the inside of the same colour that I use for the outside, which obviously I will explain when we get to it. So along with this, obviously, as I mentioned earlier, it will be the hilt and the crossguard on the sword, as well as the three parts on his helmet here that you can see are white. So it's the two winged parts and then the horn that comes up the front. I did consider painting the mask itself in this colour, but I thought that might be a bit too much. If it was all a silver metallic, then it probably would have been okay, but I think the whole mask in this may not have looked right, and so I decided to go for the silver metallic or lead belcher mask, so the steel or iron mask with these brass copper type bits coming off. So obviously being as careful as I can not to get anything on the horse here. Also you'll notice that with his cloak he has the chainmail pieces there as well, and I've gone and painted them also in black so that they can have a layer of lead belcher applied later on. So we'll jump on and take a look at the next steps. Okay, so with these areas painted with the Screaming Bell, you can see I'm now going in with the same non-oil and Screaming Bell mix, and I've already done one layer of this. I'm now going in over it again and just applying these very small dots, just to give a little bit more texture to this piece. And I think here you can probably see it much more clearly than what the face plate of the horse was showing. Obviously try not to forget up here, I do tend to make too much of a straight pattern here, try not to have it spaced out so evenly as I did there. I do go back in and darken some of those lower down spots up a little bit and blend them together a little bit more, just so it's not so much of a defined pattern. The point of this is to keep it as random and splotchy as possible, obviously closer together and more compact lower down in areas, and then have them spaced out a little bit more apart as you get to those areas that will be lighter or further away from such a dented area. And then I'm just using it as pretty much a straight wash over the top of this, because it has that metallic or that metal in the wash. It still keeps a little bit of a sheen on there, but obviously dulling it down because of the oil, but not as bad as what a straight non-oil would do to this. Okay, so with the rider I'm going to do the same thing with the Nighthaunt Gloom and thinning that down with the water. So this is a 1-to-1 mix of water and gloom. So slightly thicker than it was before, but I don't build up as many layers. You can see here I'm just trying to get a gradual blend into the white tips there of the ghostly part of this. I didn't want the green on the rider. I've decided for my night haunts that the haunts themselves are going to be this sort of ghostly blue to white, and then the horses will be the darker colour down to that ghostly green, and then I'll probably do the same with lanterns and other certain flamey type pieces. We'll have them more in that ghostly green, but for the night haunts themselves I've decided that I like the look of this white to bluish look. So again, just applying this as smooth as I can. I think for this I probably do maybe 4 or 5 layers rather than the 15 odd that I did for the horse. Like I say, I'm not looking for a full solid dark coat, but I am looking for that blend that as it gets towards the black of his overrobe or cowl or whatever you want to call it, that will become darker up there. And then the same thing as I get to the white areas, I'll just wash off the brush slightly. There we go, we can spit that out. So I will rinse the brush slightly and just again feather that down into the white. So you can see here, after letting the first layer dry, I'm now going in and doing it again. And what I've done for the inside is I quickly removed the rider and did a couple of quick coats just on the inside, just to darken that up in there a little bit. It doesn't have to be perfect in there, it's not easily visible unless you angle the model in a certain way, but you don't want that left pure white in there, as that will stand out. So just darken it up again, the same way as we're doing it on the outside. As it gets to the tips it doesn't need to be as dark, sorry, we can have that lighter, and then as you get further up into that cavity up inside the body, you can just darken it up a little bit, but it doesn't need to go nearly as dark as or as smooth as we want it on the outside, unless you want to be a bit more of a perfectionist, and then by all means go ahead for that. So we'll jump on and take a look at the next step. Okay, so next up I'm just going to take some lead belcher, and I'm just going to use this on a few of the small silver places or metallic places that we've got. So obviously that's the blade of the sword here, the rider's mask, the couple of small rings that you can see that attach to the rider's sword holder. There's a small ring there, and then the outside areas of the bar that goes in the horse's mouth. You've got the 2 little pieces that sort of hang down there. I did them in this colour as well, and then also the chainmail that's just under the cowl. And obviously, as you can see with the ghostly part of the rider there, that I didn't have that that wash go so dark as I did with the horse. I wanted to leave some of that lighter colour that the white undercoat gives it. And I do believe I did also take some white on a dry brush and just run that over the ends of the ghostly parts as well, just to lighten them up and blend that a little bit more back into the blue. So as you can see, it's just the couple of bits either side of the jaw here, and that's it for the silver. So we'll move on to the next step and be back in just a bit. Okay, so next up I'm going to take some Rhinox hide, and I'm going to use this for that that cowl piece that he's got over his shoulders, over his back. and obviously just go in and give this a nice smooth coat, obviously being careful not to hit anywhere else that we have already painted, which at this point is the majority of the model. You can see his arms are now looking paler. Again, the camera cut off whilst I was recording. There's a sort of time limit on the camera that I can't remove, but all I did with his arms was just a very light dry brushing of white scar over the top, just to pale them down a little bit, and to take that bone colour down to a more pale, not so much rotting flesh, but just a paler bone. So obviously go nice and neat all over the with the Rhinox hide, and we'll be back in just a tick. Okay, so I've now mixed in a small amount of the pallid witch flesh to the Rhinox hide, both of which are already on the wet palette, and I'm just picking off some edges. This isn't a harsh difference between the two, but it is enough that you don't want to go too mad with it. I'm just picking off sort of those rounded areas and sort of the sharper edges, as I will be going over this with another brown at some point anyway. So just sort of lightening up and picking off some of those edges just to add a bit of definition to it. Okay, and with all of that now dry, I'm now going to take some Dune Bull Brown and thinned it down slightly, go back over those raised areas that I did with the mix there, and just sort of pick those off so that they get a little bit more of that reddish brown tint to them. Obviously this is just on the for edge highlights, picking around the edges where it comes down onto the blue area of his ghostly form, and then some of the harder edges and folds on the cloak itself. Okay, so now I'm going to take some Nuln oil and I'm just going to shade up the blade and the mask of the rider, and this is just to dirty it down a little bit, dull it down. I don't want a clean looking blade for this guy, so this will just add a little bit of shade in there, obviously focusing it a little bit more towards the bottom, not letting it pool up too much, but just enough to stain the blade. And obviously the same with his mask, but letting it pool in some of the eye sockets and the recesses, and little bits, just to give a little bit more of a definition to it. So nothing too complicated, just a quick straight wash and let that dry, and we'll be back in just a bit. Right, so next up I'm going to highlight some of the black leather areas. So for this I'm going to take some Eshin Grey and obviously thin it down slightly, as with all my paints. And for this, just obviously turning the model sideways. You'll notice I'm not using the painting handle anymore. This doesn't fit great on the size handle that I've got, and so I'm just being extra careful when I'm holding the model that I'm not going to rub any paint off. And all I'm doing is just running this very fine, just the tip of it down the outside edges of the scarab part here, or whatever it is called, and again a very thin line right down the center as well. And then I do the same with the straps on the horse for the reins, again just picking off that top and bottom edge, being very careful not to apply any thick blobs or anything, just a nice thin line along those surfaces. Okay, and for a sharper, crisper highlight on the black areas, I'm taking some Dawnstone, and again, just very carefully, right on the edge, just picking off some sharp highlights there. So it's in exactly the same place as we just applied the Eshin Grey, but going even slightly thinner than we did for that, and sort of spacing it a little bit along the edge, so that it's a bit more of a broken highlight, and not going right up to the Screaming Bell sections. This leaves just a small gap on the end. And then obviously for the reins, just following along the top outer edge of the reins, not the bottom. This is just somewhere for the light to catch on those sort of most top reached areas. Okay, so now I'm taking some Doombull Brown and using a very old, very beaten brush that is now more of a stippling brush than anything else. The bristles on it are very sort of spread apart and splayed, and there's no getting a point back to this. All I'm doing is just very gently dotting in some of that Doombull brown up the blade, and this is going to give it a bit of a rust effect. So this is the first tone for this, obviously a little bit on the mask there as well, and a little bit on the chainmail. The way that I'm doing this is just dabbing this into the paint on the wet palette, and then dabbing it a few more times in an area that has no paint, just to remove some of the excess, so it doesn't splotch on too much, and then just touching that to the surfaces so that it just picks off what's left on the tip of the bristles on the brush. So once that's done with the Doombull Brown, I'll let that dry. And now a couple of paints that I use that aren't Citadel. Obviously I've used everything that is Games Workshop brand at the minute for this, but these two paints are from Reaper Miniatures. They're good paints. I do enjoy using these paints. I don't have any Games Workshop equivalents to these, which is why I am using these. But I will say that for this one, Volcanic Orange, this is from their Master Series Paints Bones range. For this you could use Riser Rust from Games Workshop, which is a technical paint, and that will give probably a better effect than this will. But you can use any kind of dull orange. You don't want to use a bright orange for this. You do want a duller orange. And again, just going over that Doombull Brown in the exact same method, but I'm not applying it with total coverage over the Doombull. This is just to add some lighter specks or flakes of rusting metal. And then for the final step on this one, it again is a slightly lighter orange. Again, this is not a bright orange, it is a bit of a dull orange, but it is a little bit brighter than the previous one. And this is just for a very small dabbing here and there over the two colours that we've already placed down. And all this does is just give a really nice rust effect, that stippled rust up and down the metal of the blade there, and obviously on his mask and chainmail. So you can see there it is more of a paler orange, which gives it that brighter look, but it's not any kind of, it hasn't had a yellow added to it, so it's not a fluorescent orange. It does have that more duller look to it. But if you haven't tried Reaper paints, then I do recommend picking up yourself one of the small starter kits that they do. I think they go for around £25 to £30, and have a go at them. They come in dropper bottles, which is nice, stops them from drying out, but they are another nice paint to use if you want to give something else a try. Okay, and for the final highlights to this piece, I'm just taking some Ahriman blue, and with a small amount on the brush here, although it covers halfway up the bristles, there's not a huge amount of paint on there. I'm just using the tip and the side of the bristles just to pick off some highlights around the broken skin areas, and you know, just some of the more slightly raised edges, just to give a little bit more highlight definition to them, make them stand out a little bit more. I do thin it ever so slightly if I'm working on a more flat area such as the ribs. You'll notice in a bit that I like to make the ribs stand out with a little bit more definition on them, but because they're a rounded surface and not a hard edge, I don't want so much of a hard line there, and by thinning the paint slightly, it just stops it from being such a harsh line. So being obviously very careful just to run this around the horse. The white dry brushing on the knight himself obviously added those hard edge highlights, so there's no need to add that there. And obviously the same on this side, although there's not as much that needs doing. Just picking off the some of the harsher edges, and then the sort of the slightly gentler edges. Again, I just use a slightly thinned down version of this just to give a softer edge, but with a bit of a crisper highlight. Okay, and here is the finished model. As you can see, I've put him on a base here. This is the standard oval base that came with him, and then I've just put a couple of pieces of blue chip slate on there, and then some gravel, obviously PVA over the top and then gravel over that. And then all I did was just spray painted that white. I removed the horse from the base. Once that dried, spray painted it white, washed over that with the Hex Wraith Flame, and then around the edges, as I wanted to get further away from that brighter area, I put in a wash of Athonian Camo Shade, and then over the rocks themselves on the outside facing edges, so the edge that we can see, I went in with some Eshin Grey followed by some Dawnstone, and that just gave the edges on this side the darker look whilst leaving that Hex Wraith Flame glow on the inside, and it gives it a very nice sort of object source lighting on the rocks. And then as you come further away from that brighter area, the green gets darker. I then dried brush over that the outer edge with some Doombald brown, and then some I believe it was Doombald brown mixed in with some, trying to think now, some Caliban green, and that just darkened the edge up back to more of an earthy tone. Unfortunately I didn't record that, but if you guys do want to see how I did that, let me know down in the comments below, and I'll do a quick 5-minute tutorial on how I got that effect, so that you guys can actually see it being done. But with that said, there's the finished model. If you want to see some more photos of it, go check out my Instagram, which is down in the description below. If you're not following me there, follow me there, and also on Twitter, so you can get updates on what I'm working on, what videos are coming up and things like that. If you enjoyed the video, hit that thumbs up button. If you're not already subscribed, hit that subscription button. It is much appreciated. Your comments that I've been receiving from you guys on some of my videos, very positive. Thank you for that. Keeps me motivated to keep doing more videos. So yeah, hit that like, hit that subscription button, and until next time, take it easy and keep painting those minis.